All right. Hello, everybody. This will be our first kind of short video, 15 minutes or so, hitting the high points of the chapter. Please note that I'm wearing a St. Louis Battlehawks hat. Each week I will have a different hat on. It may be in your best interest to keep track of which hats I wear in my videos. Or you may not. It's completely up to you. All right, so these short videos, please do not use this short video as a substitute for actually reading the chapter. Okay, I've created PowerPoints, that outline the main points of the chapter, and they're more extensive than they would have been if I had just been, doing these lectures in person. This chapter would actually be a lot easier if we were meeting in person because, there's a lot going on in here. But obviously we cannot, so let's just do the best we can with this. But again, please read the chapter, okay? All right, so when we talk about political beliefs or extremist beliefs, we often discuss them kind of on this ideological continuum, right, from left to right. You hear all the time, this person's left wing or right wing or, whatever. So we're talking about continuum. So kind of interestingly, this continuum is created based on where certain types of people sat in the French Parliament type assembly at the beginning of the French Revolution, and just kind of stuck since then. So you had people of certain ideology on the left, you had people on the right, you had people in the center, which kind of is still how it is today. So if you think about the continuum kind of as a half circle, kind of, all right? So you got people kind of along this continuum. Because you have this circle, obviously you have more people here in the middle. So you have left, and then kind of this cut in the cut in the center, and then the right. So obviously you have the most people here in the middle. So if you kind of think about this as like half circle extended, right? You talk about this fringe left and fringe right. Really, when you get out here on the fringes and get real fringy in some of these ideologies, it's almost as if this thing has kind of worked its way back around to where they're almost next to each other. Because a lot of times there's not a whole lot of difference when you really get on the edges here between right and left. They're almost all super radical. They're, terrorist. So, when you're more in the continuum, yes, there's obvious differences. But by the time you get way out here on the outskirts, a lot of times there's not a whole lot difference from one to the other. All right, so this continuum moves from fringe left to fringe right. There's various levels of left and various levels of right in this continuum. I'm not going to go over all of them because, my gosh, that would be a video all of itself. So since this is a terrorism class, anything that isn't fringe or far right really isn't any kind of threat for terrorism. So the fringes are your most biggest chance that they're going to have some terrorism. So the fringe left is usually some extreme interpretation of Marxist theory, class warfare, ethno-national liberation. They literally view themselves as at war with this oppressive system, oppressive class, or oppressive government that justifies the use of violence. They're only concerned with destroying the system, not actually replacing it. Okay? Think about the type of terrorism that is. We've already talked about it in previous chapters. Make sure you figure that out. All right, far left also uses Marxist theory to promote class or ethno-national rights. Now, when you go from fringe to far is not necessarily violent, okay? And they could be, but they're not necessarily. Fringe almost always is, but far is not necessarily. And they typically will participate in democratic processes, elections, voting, that sort of thing. All right, so then the far right, remember I'm skipping everything in the middle, far right espouses a strong and relatively extreme adherence to social order and traditional values. Oftentimes in the far right you have some kind of chauvinistic, racial, ethnic dimension, something along those lines. Extreme in orientation, but again, not necessarily violent. Okay, because we're in the far, we're not in the fringe yet. And just like the far left, the far right also typically participates in democratic processes. The fringe right is rooted in its uncompromising belief in ethno-national or religious superiority. They're champions of this somewhat ideal order. Violence is justified against anyone or anything that would be an obstacle or problem for this order. So, violence on the fringes. All right, so the chapter goes on, and there's a lot in this chapter I'm not going to be able to cover in this video, but just the high points here. There's several ideologies that they talk about in here: anarchism, Marxism, fascism. Okay, and you hear these words thrown around a lot in today's day and age. Even stuff like far right, far left, fringe. Okay, you hear these words. Most of the time, these are thrown around by people that don't know what they mean. So please do me a favor. Please do learn these terms. Know what anarchism is. Know what Marxism is. Know what fascism is. Know what actually is the far right. What is the far left. So when somebody actually does do this and throws these words around and calls people things, you can actually know whether or not what they're doing is actually what those terms mean, or if they're just, people just trying to cause trouble, or people just trying to paint somebody with a brush that they don't necessarily deserve to be painted with. Okay, politicians do it, media does it, and it's ridiculous how often this happens. So please do, learn these terms, know what they mean, so that you're one of the informed ones that actually know what's going on. All right, off my soapbox, at least for now. All right, so let's talk about anarchism, Marxism, and fascism. Real quick hitters on this. So anarchism came out of the mid-19th century Europe. Anarchists abhor any kind of centralized authority of any kind, whether it be government, any kind of centralized anything that puts any kind of rules in place. Anarchists hate it. So their only thing they want to do is just overthrow the system. They have no idea what to do after that, because what do you do when you have no kind of centralized authority? Like, what does it even look like? Well, nobody knows, because it doesn't work, right? The anarchists have been responsible for quite a bit of violence over the years. In fact, President McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. All right, Marxism. Karl Marx is the founder of modern socialism. So radical socialism is a leftist ideology that argues that wealth produced by workers should be equally distributed rather than concentrated in a wealthy elite. Marxists advocate the overthrow of capitalism, want to replace it with socialism, which then turns into communism. So anyone that says that socialism does not have to turn into communism doesn't really understand socialism, because Marx himself said that it would naturally turn into communism. And he actually wrote the manifesto of the Communist Party. Lots of examples of this from history: Lenin, Stalin, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and Fidel Castro. All right, fascism. Okay, this is like the right side counterpoint to Marxism. Okay, so this grew out of a reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which is a communist revolution in Russia. So fascism championed its alleged superiority of a particular national heritage, was anti-communist, anti-monarchist, anti-democratic, and anti-intellectual. It demanded extreme obedience to law, order, and the state, which, if you know anything about communism, that's also something very similar to communism. I mean, look at what's going on in China right now. Excuse me, gosh. So Mussolini was kind of the first, followed by Hitler, then Franco in Spain. Fascism itself was pretty well crushed after World War II, after Mussolini, after Hitler, after everybody was defeated. But now there's this new kind of brand, new version of it called neo-fascism, which just means new fascism. All right, so left-wing extremism and terrorism. All right. So we start talking about nationalism. Well, there's left-wing nationalism, right-wing nationalism. Sometimes when something is just strictly nationalism, it's very difficult to define whether it's left wing or right wing, and then those terms really get kind of imprecise. It's really difficult to put nationalism on that continuum that we were just talking about, from left to right. But there have been instances of leftist nationalism throughout history. It's when nationalists have selectively utilized Marxist principles. Normally, these materialize as kind of revolutions in the developing world. Think about like Cuba, China, Vietnam, places like that. Special interest leftist extremism. This is single issue terrorism, okay, that occurs on the left. Generally considered to be the realm of like animal rights and environmental extremists, but there are also neo-anarchists and other kinds of radicals that would be considered special interest on the left. And then left-wing terrorists, man, there's all kinds of examples in the book in a variety of different contexts, Latin America, Europe. Nowhere near enough time to go into this video with them. So learn about them. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to the fringe and the far right. All right, so the fringe and far right. So it's interesting because this chapter doesn't really talk about the American far right. Chapter 12 will talk about the American far right. And why it doesn't do that is because the right is very context specific, whereas the left kind of has these broad, kind of overarching kind of thought processes and ideologies associated with it. The right is much more context specific. So terrorism on the right is an outgrowth of fascist, national socialist, which is Nazis, Falangist, other reactionary movements in Europe. So there are some broad commonalities, but the right is very context specific. So the fringe and the far right is pretty much longing for this kind of utopia where they feel like their power wasn't usurped by any group, where they had full power, they were in charge of things. So what they do is they use scapegoating, and the fringe and far right are both very good at scapegoating particular groups of people. Which group? Well, it depends on the specific characteristics and the environment. So here we go again, right? It depends. So one pretty common component of the reactionary right is nationalism, or loyalty to a group, or some kind of group unity. So the main question you should be asking yourself here is then to whom, right? To whom are you loyal? Is this country we're talking about? Race, ethno-national identity, religion, something else? What are we talking about? With the right, there's no set standard. Like it could be anything. Obviously, race is one of the most common that you hear about associated with the far fringe right, but also loyalty to country. Now, country is different than government. Okay, a lot of the right is very anti-government. Loyalty to country is different. There's also a lot of religion and mysticism in the far and fringe right. The Nazis did mess around some with the occult. See the movie The Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? That's what they're doing in there. I'm sure it's very historically factual. But there's also a lot of other religion kind of mixed in, some of this far right stuff. Very fundamentalist Christian identity, Asatru, other pagan Nordic religions, creativity, cosmotheism. There's a whole bunch of different far and fringe right religions. So we talk about right-wing terrorism. Right-wing terrorism isn't nearly as organized as what the left has been. And again, no overarching ideology that ties groups or movements together. So far and fringe right terrorists have generally just operated as small cells or like street militias, street brawlers. Think about like gangs of skinheads here. So because of the scapegoating, because of this, they're more indiscriminate in their target selection. So they often kind of identify these entire groups of people as enemies and worthy of attack, even though 99% of the people in that group haven't done anything to deserve any kind of attack. But they simply are part of some race or some whatever group that is targeted. Right-wing groups are also notoriously short-lived. And I found that in my research, most groups survive less than 3 years, and of those, most of them survive less than a year. So then the book goes into, again, a bunch of examples from around the world. We're not going to spend any time here doing that, but be sure you go through and check those out. All right, so then finally, new terrorism. Overall, kind of these leftist movements that we've been talking about, they've all kind of been defeated, kind of just gone away. The fall of the Soviet Union was a big blow to those that are ardent followers of Marxism. Now, it doesn't say there can't be something still spawned, kind of in retaliation to right wing or something related to globalization. Some of this Antifa, some of that kind of stuff. But the right will continue to do what the right does, and what the right's always done. They'll find a group of people to hate and then hate on them, or find a government to hate and hate that government. So, leftists and right, as far as new terrorism, because new terrorism really is more about these, radical Islamist groups, these cell-based groups. So when you just start talking left and right, the new left and right will kind of look like the old, probably. All right, so I'm going to stop here. Make sure you go through the PowerPoint, read the chapter. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll see you next week.